So now this is the keynote lecture, and I will just introduce Gert briefly because I think you know about all the fantastic work that Gert has done. And I just have to say that I didn't even realize until I got to prepare for this introduction, just how much Gert Biesta's work has influenced my own. I have a few sort of go-to phrases that sort of ring in my head frequently, and the favorite is probably why what works still won't work. So that's, I think, one of the titles of Gert's articles. And also his challenge, whether we measure what we value or whether we value what we measure. So again, a kind of useful expression, and of course a useful concept to think about. And in his latest book, World-Centered Education, A View from the Present, Gert speaks about the need to restore the conversation about education because, and now I quote, what is distinctly educational about education has disappeared from sight, or has at the very least moved to the margins of the contemporary educational conversation. And so I think that this commitment to challenging our ideas about what should happen in spaces that we might call educational has been, as far as I can see, a major theme in your work, Gert. And I've experienced many fruitful and unsettling moments with my own students when we adopted one of your texts, and adopted again is your phrase, by which for others, Gert insists that knowing is not an act of comprehension, but rather an event of reception. And I think this sort of deceptively simple idea contains, for me anyway, what ether means by ethical and aesthetic. And I'm just really delighted, Gert, that you have accepted our invitation to share your thoughts with us today. So just a few points. Gert is, of course, a professor of public education at Maynooth University in Ireland, as well as a professor of educational theory and pedagogy at Edinburgh. And he also holds a number of international visiting professorships. He's written numerous books, too many to mention here, and articles, and I think they have been translated into something like over 20 different languages. He's advised the Dutch government on curriculum for primary and secondary education. Now, Gert will speak for about 45 minutes, and we will then open out for a Q&A. But of course, as you've been doing so far, do please feel free to pose your questions or comments in the chat throughout the talk, and we'll be picking them up as we go and try to bring them into the Q&A session. So once again, thank you, Gert, so much for being here with us. And now over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that introduction. It's lovely to be together, even in this strange way. I feel joy. The morning was wonderful, but I'm also pretty nervous. So let's see what's possible and how I can improvise my way through everything I've prepared. I'll show a PowerPoint, which partly helps me, and maybe some of you also like to read. There are too many ideas here, too much text, and still that's life, and that's how we make life. I also want to thank Julie and Jill for the sign language interpretation, which is really hard work, but also wonderful to see, because in most cases with other presentations, the interpreters stand next to you, you never see them. So this is quite special too. I'm entering into a conversation that has been going on for a while, so I'm aware of that as well, but I hope that I can share some thoughts that may help around the encounter with the other. And of course, I'll raise some questions around that. And I try to speak to these issues as an educator and an educationalist. The title hopefully has some meaning and it will become clear, but I want to turn around the question of education and in a sense then return to questions that are often now seen as questions from the past, questions about teaching, for example, which I think is far more progressive than a lot of talk about learning. I will explore 5 questions I'm asking myself, and probably there say maybe we need a little less ethics and a little bit more encounter, and I'll try to make a case for that. I will also reflect on the notion of empowerment, which is quite prominent in education. And I want to put another notion there, the idea of education as disarmament. And hopefully some of that also becomes clear. Because I think disarmament may have something to do with the whole question of how our souls can be touched. We spoke a lot this morning about the heart, and I saw that movement, so I'm also curious where the soul is sort of located in sign language. And for me, the possibility to be touched has something to do with aesthetics. And one concern I have is that a lot of education nowadays has become anesthetic. It numbs our students so that they can very quickly move to sort of producing measurable learning outcomes. And for me, that's a travesty of education. So I'm interested as an educator in the question of pedagogy, and I'm not claiming that it's only teachers who perform pedagogy. I think art performs pedagogy as well, and I heard a lot about that this morning too. Now, for me, the question of pedagogy raises 3 positions. There is what you can call a third-person position, where we do theoretical work and try to explain and understand, and there is a place for that. But there is also a first-person position, and that's the question, what am I to do? And that's a question for each of us as a singular I, you could say. What I find interesting is where the teacher or the educator is in relation to this. And for the moment, I want to ponder the idea that to be a teacher is to stand in a second-person position, and maybe it's a strange idea, but I think that teaching always involves triadic relationships. So it's not entirely a dialogue, but it's a relationship between student, world, and the teacher, where ultimately the teacher has to leave the scene. And I try to live by this beautiful couple of sentences from Bertolt Brecht. Jeder Lehrer muss lernen, mit dem Lehren aufzuhören, wenn es Zeit ist. And of course, we never know what exactly when it's time. Das ist eine schwere Kunst. Die wenigsten sind imstande, sich zu gegebener Zeit von der Wirklichkeit vertreten zu lassen. So Brecht is saying that we need to stand back as teachers at the right moment so that the world can step in. So what I'll try to do in the talk is to push back against too much third-person talk, you could say, not in order to be anti-intellectual, but also to see what theory does for the first-person issues we encounter, and for this whole question of this strange position of the teacher. And I'll do that through 5 questions about preparation, culture, the other time, and pedagogy, and time will be short. And it feels a bit like knitting with too many needles. So we need to see whether a nice sock will emerge at the end or not. Preparation is a very common trope in education, where education is very often presented as a preparation for later. The idea that we equip students with knowledge, skills, dispositions, and so on for work, for life, for citizenship. I read somewhere it's a preparation for eternal life, preparation for more education, but also a big discourse about preparing students for encounters with others. Now, if you are in education, you may know this phrase from John Dewey, who says, no, education is not a preparation for later, but it's life, which is fine, but not all life is education. So there is still the question, what kind of life then is education? Now, one concern with all this emphasis on preparation is that it thinks through the logic of empowerment. We try to equip our students. You can say we try to arm our students with all these things. And here you can see a definition of what arming actually is. And although I think a lot of empowerment is done out of good intentions, there is a problem that before you know it, you end up in a mindset where the other is first of all seen as a potential threat, where the first interest for me is sort of my own survival. And the future begins to be a kind of battlefield where we all come empowered for the encounter. That's my worry when there is too much empowerment going on, because you can say when you begin to empower, you begin to build a harness around yourself. And that begins to raise the question, can something still come through? Can you still be touched? And for me, this speaks to the danger that education actually becomes an anesthetizing process, if I pronounce that correctly, where students are empowered so much that nothing can enter any longer. Are these abstract concerns? Not for me. When I look at a field like intercultural education, where the encounter with others is framed as intercultural, I see an awful lot of effort that for me all has to do with empowering, with giving students sort of all the stuff, all the equipment to be able to, use a quote from a policy document, communicate effectively and appropriately with people from other language and cultural backgrounds. And then you get all these lists: empathy, respect, tolerance, sensitivity, flexibility. I'm never sure about those lists. Maybe after the event, you can say that was an interesting encounter and there was empathy at play, or tolerance, or sensitivity. But when you step into the encounter, and often encounters are surprises that are beyond our control, all of these things may be there or may not be there. So there is the real question whether these lists that are sort of circulated in education actually speak to the reality of the encounter. The other question that I find urgent but also difficult is that I am not sure whether everyone deserves my empathy, respect, tolerance, sensitivity, and flexibility. If I say it very bluntly, I cannot frame Putin in this. And for me, in a lot of work around intercultural education, I see actually that the real questions are, in a sense, absent. They are in the margin, or they are off the table. And that has a lot to do with how this is framed in terms of competencies, competence, being competent to do all kind of things. If you know the field, you may come across this, which is repeated many times. Competence in the center, and then values, attitudes, skills, knowledge, and critical understanding. And what I find remarkable here is that there is something missing. And actually what I think is missing is the who. Who is actually the one who has values, attitudes, skills, knowledge, critical understanding? Who is the one who selects and mobilizes and deploys all these things? Who is the one who judges what is appropriate and effective? But at a very fundamental level even, who's the one who can be bothered to engage, to encounter? So all these strategies of empowerment actually lack the one who should be in the center, namely each of us. So here I have raised questions about this idea that education is a kind of preparation, and maybe it's not. It is connected, and at least in this thread, to the question of culture. And again, in the whole field of intercultural communication, intercultural education, many scholars have raised really important and valuable questions about culture. Can we simply map nation on culture on language? Of course not. Can we think of culture as monolithic and static? Of course not. Can we simply say that identity is linked with culture and becomes cultural identity? Also not. But again, one question that I see less there, you could say, but maybe it says something about my reading, is that these discussions sort of assume that culture exists. And I'm always inclined to say culture is not a thing. Culture is a very particular explanation of the experience of difference. You could even say culture is an explanation of encounter, but culture is never the encounter itself. The problem there is then that when you use the word culture, very quickly you work with the distinction of nature and culture. And then when you begin to name differences as cultural differences, I think you begin to explain them in a very particular way. And my worry is that those explanations actually eradicate the difference. They remove you from the encounter. So to say to someone else, well, your difference from me is merely cultural, you're actually saying it appears as cultural within the frame I have, and there is no longer the question whether that frame itself is shared. That's why a lot of the socio-cultural theories going around in education for me are problematic. You can also say and see probably that when culture appears as an explanation of difference, it has a really colonial gesture in it, where you say, I claim the right to explain you from where I am. What I also find fascinating is a text from Martin Heidegger, who not simply shows that culture is explanation, but who actually makes the case that the very idea of culture, you could say, of a particular view on the world, is a very modern view. The idea that our relationship with the world is about the way in which we see the world. There's a lot of talk about perspectives, for example. Heidegger says that idea in itself is modern. And therefore, to say it very quickly, and of course I'm sort of referring to a number of really big discussions, we cannot speak about a modern worldview that may differ from a pre-modern worldview, because Heidegger would say, and I think he has a point there, that the very idea that we have a view on the world, that's possible, that in itself is a modern idea. How does that come back to education? You can say as long as we think that our relationships and our encounters with others, our cultural relationships, for example, relationships that require an explanation, in a sense, we refuse the encounter and put a theory above it. Why am I so critical about this? Because this idea that we can explain others and that is helpful is at the center of critical pedagogies, particularly critical pedagogies that rely on notions of false consciousness, which comes out of Marxist theory, or misrecognition, which comes from Bourdieu. Now, what false consciousness and misrecognition sort of do is that they say there is someone, a teacher, an emancipatory teacher, who says to students, I can tell you what is really going on in your life, or I can tell you what's really going on in your head, or I can tell you what your feelings really are and what they are really about. And I think at some point this is actually not emancipatory at all, because as soon as you claim as teacher that you can tell your students the truth about themselves, then you block the space for the students to arrive in the world. So this whole question of cultural explanation is not just a theoretical discussion, but I see that it's a real issue for how we think about emancipatory pedagogy. This is not something I've made up. I've been inspired by the work of Jacques Rancière, who has this interesting book called Le Maître Ignorant, the ignorant schoolmaster. And that's not a schoolmaster who knows nothing about the area in which they are teaching, but it's a schoolmaster who understands that the teacher needs to remain ignorant about the student and not claim that teachers can and should explain students. And I think this wonderfully connects to a theme that came up this morning. To what extent should we as teachers know our students? To what extent should we ask our students to tell their stories? And I'm always trying to resist that a little. Not to say that the relationship with our students should be cold and without any interest, but we should be very careful how much we actually want to know and how quickly that may get in the way of something education. So if you can sort of still see what I'm trying to do, but it's a little journey. This, you can say, brings us to the question of the other, which is the central question today and in this whole Ether project. Now, when we think of these encounters, say, as intercultural encounters, you can say that these encounters are framed in a very particular way, which I would characterize as viewing the other. That means that in that understanding of intercultural relationships, encounters, you can say that I'm positioned as a spectator of the other. I like the German word Beobachter, but I'm not entirely sure why. And when you then have this image and begin to think back about all these competency frameworks for intercultural communication, what they all try to do is to see how I can become more competent as a spectator of others. And I think that that's a strange and maybe a problematic way of staging what's going on. And for me, the image that I thought of is actually that of a bird watcher. And of course, to be a good bird watcher, you need values, attitude, skills, knowledge. But in that way of thinking about the encounter, the relationship is staged in a very particular way. Now, there is something important about this, and it has to do with when you look at the visual art, you can say the emergence of perspectivism, and the idea that a painting has a perspective that emerges toward the end of the Middle Ages, if I'm correct, and we have non-perspective art from older days. And I just put one drawing from M.C. Escher there, who plays with this whole question of what's the perspective from which this painting is painted, or the drawing drawn. The importance, you can say, of perspectivism is that it allows for a standpoint for the observer, and that then creates a field in which the ones who are observed can be positioned. And there you can begin to see that this idea that the encounter is one of me viewing others is quite a big event in how we think about our relationship with the world. And I think this idea that we occupy a perspective from which we view the world is the modern dualism, and it's a much more important one than sort of the mind-body dualism. The possibility for a position, you can say, is important because it begins to delineate a space in which I can be. And that's, you can say, the importance here, that the whole question of the I and where the I is located becomes a possibility. The problem is that in one and the same move, the I only arrives in the world as a spectator, as a viewer. And this, I think, is still troubling a lot of talk and understanding about intercultural encounters with the other, that they always start with an I who then needs to encounter, connect, understand, empathize with, get into a dialogue, and so on. Here I see the importance of the work of Emmanuel Levinas, which also has come up in the Ether project. Because Levinas, in a sense, raises a very fundamental question about what somewhere he calls an ego-logical worldview, and a worldview that sort of starts with the ego and assumes the ego is there first, and then the ego begins to engage with the world, with other people, with living nature. And Levinas pushes back against that idea, and I think that's a helpful response to what I just called perspectivism. So he pushes back against the idea that we first need to know before we can act. He pushes back against the idea that we first need to understand before we can live, you could say. So in a slightly bigger way of putting it, he pushes back against any idea that sort of the theoretical perspective on the world comes first, that I am there first and have a view of the world, and then everything else begins. And when you come to think about it in those words, you probably can see quite soon that that's actually a very odd idea. But historically, this is a very powerful way that I think is still present today in discussions about encounters, but also in discussions about education, preparation, empowerment. Levinas sort of argues for a term, and one way in which he does that is by going to ethics and saying ethics is actually first philosophy. So it's not epistemology is not the theory of knowledge. It's not hermeneutics, the theory of understanding. It's not ontology, the theory of everything, but ethics comes first. Now, I find it important to emphasize that that doesn't mean that Levinas is telling all human beings that they should be responsible or that the ability to respond is primary. I think I read Levinas through the helpful language of Zygmunt Bauman, who has this phrase, which I think is brilliant, when he says, the point of Levinas is that he says, responsibility is the first reality of the self. And that means no more than that you can say the whole question of me, of myself, becomes an issue when I encounter a responsibility. When I encounter someone who speaks to me, asks something from me, blames or shames me, you can say what we really encounter there is our own freedom. Because when we encounter a responsibility, there is a question in front of us. Do I say yes or do I walk away? And that question is a first-person question. No one else can solve that question for me. So here things begin to turn, where you say the first question is not from me to you. How would I like to encounter you? Even before that becomes a question for me, the other is already encountering me. And you can say in that encounter, I come into play. This is not a theory or an ontology or an explanation, I would say, but this is phenomenology in the true sense of the word. It's phenomenology as about what appears. And you can say what appears when I encounter a responsibility is that I appear to myself as an I with freedom, the freedom to say yes or the freedom to say no. So this is, in a sense, an ethical universe without any ethical pressure. It is actually ethics that exposes the possibility and also the difficulty of my freedom. That brings me to the question of time. And I didn't have time to use that to look at all the provocations, and I'm more and more frustrated about that. But I'm really curious also to see in those provocations questions of space and questions of time, and I think they are there. I've watched the one with music, which for me is always very temporal, and architecture has something more spatial. Now, some people might say the question of the encounter is a spatial question. It's how you and I meet in space. There's something that speaks to that also this morning about sort of classroom spaces and what happens there. But I still like a book I read long ago from Johannes Fabian on Time and the Other, how anthropology makes it object, and he makes an interesting point there where he says real communication assumes a shared time. In German it's Gleichzeitigkeit. In English it has been translated as co-evilness, which doesn't speak to my sense of English. So gleichzeitig means to be in the same time. And then Fabian makes an interesting observation where he says what anthropology tends to do is to deny the existing in the same time by saying the other culture that we're going to study as anthropologists is in a different time, often the time of the past, a different stage of development, you could say. And he calls this tendency to place the other in a different time, he calls that Allocronism. And for me, this connects back to the whole question of cultural explanation, where we say, oh, in the encounter, we meet other cultures or people from other culture or people with a different cultural identity. And I think there is something allocronistic going on there as well. Maybe not so much because we're saying, oh, your culture is behind my culture, but maybe as long as we name encounters in those particular ways, we deny the contemporaneity of our encounter. And that, you can say, is the problem as long as we think of encounters in terms of observation. And with observation comes this whole toolkit of interpreting the other, understanding the other, knowing the other, signifying the other. Out of that comes a really interesting challenge, and I still do not entirely know what's in that challenge, but nonetheless I felt that it was important to name it, because pushing back against all the competency frameworks and approaches in education that just want us to become better observers of others so that we can better engage with others. Maybe there is a question that cuts through that and is far more difficult to engage with. The question how we manage in those encounters to be contemporaries. There is a nice little book that provided me the inspiration for this, called Zeitgenossen werden. What does it mean actually in an encounter to try to be in the same time and of the same time? And when I read the news these days, that question stays with me. I don't know how to respond to it, but I think the whole question of being in the same time has become a very urgent political question. That already brings me to the fifth question I wanted to ask, and that's the question of pedagogy. And I think I'll manage with the time. So what I've tried to do so far is to highlight some problems with what I call third-person perspectives. You can say theoretical explanations of encounters, because I think they always run the risk of eradicating the encounter itself. And what I've tried to do is to turn to the importance of what I call the first-person perspective or the first-person position, and both words are not entirely great. To say, actually, in the encounter, there is something for me to do, and a theory can never do that work for me. But then there is the question of education and of the educator, which I here call the question of pedagogy, which is an odd term because for me, coming out of Dutch and German language, it means more than I think what it means in English. Now, it is possible to approach the question of education and the question of pedagogy in terms of the question, what should we do? What should we aim for? And that's a good question, but I think it also misses something. And quite often, if we think that that's the educational question, what should we do with our students? How should our students become? We very quickly end up in wishful thinking, where we have beautiful ideas, but the whole question, whether we can get there and how we can get there is not really engaged. Another book that has really inspired me, or actually a whole body of work, is from a German educational scholar, Klaus Branger, who says, actually, education all begins with the form of pedagogy. And I find that interesting, and I've done work with colleagues in different professional fields, arts, mental health, to figure out what are these different forms and what's there in the form. Prange's point, and right now I'm quite sort of, I think it's a really valid point, is that he says, what's the fundamental and distinctive form of education? It is in German zeigen, and zeigen is both to point and to show. And he says that's actually going on in education. So when there is no zeigen, when people are not pointing and showing, then actually there is no education. There may be something else is going on. A good conversation, a beautiful encounter, but not education. Why is pointing important? Because it does two things at the same time. The teacher points and says to the student, look there, or listen to that, or pay attention. But in one and the same gesture that sort of points away, the teacher also points to the student and says, you pay attention. And there you can see something of the triadic structure of teaching. The teacher, the student, and something, I would call it the world. Prange calls it the theme, you can say the issue. And you can say that the work of education is how you can realize an articulation between these three elements. What's very funny, I think, is that Prange says that means that teaching is first of all a form of manual labor. You need the hand in order to do the pointing. And teaching tries to focus attention. Can also say, as teachers, we demand attention. But we can never enforce our students' attention. We can never control the attentiveness of our students. So we may manage to direct or redirect the attention of our students, but what they do there, that's up to them. And we can stand there with expectations and hopes, but not with control. And I think this is partly the beauty of the point here, that you can say, if education is fundamentally about pointing, in that form, you can already see that the freedom of the student matters. That's, of course, not this crazy neoliberal idea that to be free means to do what you want to do. I call it the freedom of shopping, where you just walk into a shop, grab what you want, and walk out without any consequences. It rather is the freedom to attend to the world, and in a sense, in meeting the world, in encountering the world, to encounter yourself in relation to the world. And for me, this highlights that in the pointing of education, the encounter is central. This for me suggests, but I'm quite radical in some of my opinions, that the whole discourse about learning, I think, has little to do here. I would be happy to say, let's take learning out of education because it's such an unhelpful notion. We should not think that we point our students so that they learn about the other, because then they step into the game of explanation. I also don't particularly like the phrase learning from the other, because before you know it, you say, yeah, I used the other for my learning. And that's also not an encounter, but it's an instrumentalization. Rather, what happens in the encounter is that we experience a moment of being taught, that we are addressed by what we encounter, by who we encounter, that we are being spoken to. And I want to claim the right not just for other human beings to speak to us, but I think that the whole world is speaking to us in all kinds of ways. That we are being touched, you could say. And there I would suggest, but this is quick, we find the real educational question, the question we find in each encounter, namely, what is this that I encounter here asking of me? And that's not a question that I can resolve by saying, if I understand it and engage with it, well, that's fine. That question, what is this asking of me, is a question that interrupts. And therefore you can say it's an aesthetic question because it potentially awakes you. And it awakes you in a very particular way because the question, what is this asking of me, puts me in question actually. And there I'm no longer empowered, but I meet a moment of disarmament where you can say the encounter is precisely what pulls me into the world. And maybe there what I meet is a call to step into the same time. So this is where I am with my thinking about this whole question of encounter and education. I think what at least my play with these questions sort of brings into view is that pedagogies of empowerment that say we need to equip and prepare our students, they focus a lot on the equipment and all these lists of what should we equip our students with. But we forget to ask, but who is the one there who we are trying to equip, and is that actually what we should be doing there? So that is what I find remarkably absent in many of these well-intended sort of empowerment approaches in education. I've also tried to say that when notions of culture come in, they often explain otherness and therefore create a distance rather than that they make an encounter possible. And there I would say it's actually really odd when you begin to read all these frameworks through this particular way of looking. You can say that the point is not to become a better observer of others and otherness, but it's actually to take the encounter seriously. And that encounter is so often not initiated by me, but comes to me. And there I think this is not a demand we find there to be ethical, but I think it's an encounter with our own freedom. That's behind the little provocation where I said maybe a little less ethics so that we can really see what the demand of an encounter is. That has something to do with the aesthetics of education, the idea that education somewhere has something to do with the touching of the soul. But here I want to at least remind myself that it's not the teacher who is the toucher of the soul of the student. Before you know it, you end up in very moralizing education, where the teacher says, I'm going to touch your soul in a particular way. We are in a very different position. This is this strange second person position. Our job is constantly to make a case for the world and say to the student, look there, turn your attention to the world. What the world may be asking of the student, that's not our business as teachers, other than that we hope that we can turn our students in that way and can help them to stay what they may encounter there. That highlights the teaching as the most important dimension there. A world that may teach, and in doing that, in that encounter, you can say the eye of the student is called into existence in a very different way from the modern eye that stands in a perspective and views the world. And there I would make this case for saying, well, a little less empowerment and a bit more of disarmament may precisely bring this important work that pedagogy can do into the frame as well. That's 45 minutes because I started 5 minutes late. So we still have some time
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, but this is it.
Yeah,
okay.
that's fantastic. Thank you, Gert, and thank you for the perfect timing. So that's brilliant. Do you know, so these seminars, I think we are kind of getting a bit of a reputation for generating these slogans for T-shirts, and Erin already suggested one based on your talk, less ethics, more encounter. So yeah, let's create those. And I think there are some more slogans that we can use, and certainly the one that you ended with, less empowerment, little more disarmament. There's lots of really thought-provoking ideas here, and I'm sure that people will want to come into this discussion. So we do have about 10 minutes for questions. We will have a 10-minute break after that, so we'll begin the conversation a little later, but I do want to invite people to respond and to engage. So what you can do is you can either raise your hand, so you know how to do it, with, so you will then appear on my screen and I'll know that you want to speak, or you can just put things in the chat, or just unmute yourself and start speaking. So yeah, over to you, whoever wants to ask a question. I could see one hand up, but unfortunately my screen isn't showing me.
It's Angela.
Angela,
Adrian.
Yeah, Angela?
Thanks, Maggie. It's me. I'm great. Yeah.
Adrian.
I really appreciated your talk, Gert, very much. And I'm particularly sympathetic to the notion of not explaining the other and resisting the urge to explain the other, taking Glissant's notion of standing in solidarity with the other without needing to explain their life and their practice. At the same time, I do ethnography. The very project of ethnography, of course, is to explain the life of the other and to explain the cultural practices of the other. And so where does that leave me? Well, with Angela Crease, over the last 2 or 3 years, what we've been doing is grappling with that question and trying to devise a means of writing ethnography which resists the urge to explanation and resists the urge to, even from the perspective of the research participants, to resist providing our account of their experience. And so the way that we've tried to do this is by writing ethnographic plays, of which we've recently written 3. And I suppose if I have, and we found this really a useful way of standing outside of the social practices that we are seeking to show, because we don't have to explain them. They're just there on stage, if you like. So I just wonder whether you see a tension between the traditional urge to explain the life of the other and the potential for perhaps arts-based representation of those lives.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good point. I once shared this critique of culture with a colleague who is a professor of anthropology, and she said, but if we give up on culture, then our whole field ceases to exist. And you ask sort of a similar question. I think it's important that ethnography resists explanation, because that gets you exactly in a very problematic relationship, and quite similar to how I try to resist explaining my students to myself or to them. But from what you say, there are other sort of modalities of ethnography. You call them representations. And I think what they do, but this is just a very quick response, I would say they become educational, because what they do is to try to frame attention in a particular way. So to say we write an ethnographic play is not just a way to represent, but it's actually a way to present so that it can focus attention from the ones who watch the play, or and for me that precisely turns the question then to the ones who watch the play, for example, or read the script, because then it becomes a question for them what they do in that encounter. And that's completely the opposite from saying we as ethnographers can provide the explanations so that everyone can have happy intercultural encounters, because then you end up in an impossible position. So I think where you're going makes it educational, but also turns the question where I think it should be, not in how you can explain, but in how you can focus attention, so that it opens up a possibility for people to say, okay, so there is something for me here to figure out.
Thank you. Yeah, great.
So that for me would be the future of ethnography, and but it brings it back to sort of educational and political questions, because then you foreground the political question, and I think that's great.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrian, for asking the question. Thanks, Gert. And Irene, you're next.
Thank you for your very, well, the talk was so broad and it brought up so many ideas that I have been pondering on throughout the last years. And I got stuck a little bit with your idea when you referred to Johannes Fabian and his idea of Gleichzeitigkeit, that theories of intercultural encounter tend to place the other in a different time scale, so to create a difference between the two. And then there is a sociolinguist, Jan Blommert, who has actually argued that there's also a danger in synchronization, so in synchronizing different time scales into one, because then we erase the face of the other and the historicity of the other. So I see a paradox in here, and also as far as I understood Levinas and his other-oriented ethics, where he made the difference between fassen und auffassen, so to apprehend and to grasp. So I feel that it's important to see the other in her own time scale, and then to see how that relates or disrelates to where I'm standing, so to my own time scale. But maybe I misunderstood you, so I wanted to hear your thoughts on this paradox or this disrelation between Fabian and the issue of synchronization.
Yeah, thanks for that, because I'm also not entirely sure what's in that. So for me, it doesn't. So when you use this notion of synchronization, that sort of suggests let's forget about all the differences and just assume that we're all here together. And I think that's naive and dangerous as well. I don't think that is, well, that's not what I read there. But for me, this idea of to become contemporaries or Zeitgenossen is not to become identical, but to say we are sort of in the same time and we are facing something together. And maybe it links to the question of solidarity, where you say, if we go on the journey together, you can say. So it's not the face-to-face, but for me, the movement of to become contemporaries is to say, okay, I face the same issues as you are facing in the way in which we also face them differently. And I think the word solidarity is really relevant there, because you can say, what is there for me to do if I try to step in the same time as where where you find yourself. So there is something there that is not about just saying we are experiencing things the same or we are the same, but it's maybe to, yeah, I come back to the word solidarity because that helps me to see what's there in trying to be Zeitgenosse. And for me, all these questions always turn back to me. So it's far less about what others think and what their ideas are, but what is there for me to do in that. So this is, yeah, a bit of messy response to what you said there. But I was thinking, because I saw your provocation, and it's interesting when you get something like, yeah, different views about homosexuality, for example, in the classroom. What do you do with that? Do you frame that as saying, oh, they have views and they're different from mine, or yeah, we were there 20 years ago, but we are now here? Or can you turn that around and say, okay, yeah, there are these different views and opinions, and they have their history and their location, but what do I do encountering all that? And for me, that's also an interesting educational move to put a different question back to your students, not which values should you adopt or which ideas should you have and which ideas are you no longer allowed to have, but okay, given that this is the reality, what do you do? So I think there's something there as well. And then you come into a different temporal relationship, I think.
Yes, I can relate to that, but I think it's difficult to become Zeitgenossen, so to become people of the same time, because then, as you have mentioned in my provocation, because then I think it's difficult to understand this self, but also the other in their own time. So, but maybe I'm viewing the things from my theoretical standpoint. But thank you very much for your
okay, thanks. Yeah.
your thoughts.